Today, we're going to focus on the Salesforce admin certification, and we're going to actually specifically focus just on the configuration and setup. It's a pretty big portion of the test. Actually, it makes up, I think, 20%. So there's a lot of things that go on in configuration setup. It's we can talk about company settings. We're going to talk about how you meaning to understand like the administration and declarative configuration of the user interface for UI settings, app menu, list views, global actions, lightning app builder, all that fun stuff. We'll talk about how to maintain users. We'll talk about the set audit trail, login hours, session settings, and things of that nature. And then also just kind of we'll talk about org-wide defaults, sharing roles, role hierarchy, report and dashboard folders. I don't really get into reports and dashboards. I cover a lot of that type of content. I should talk about reports and dashboards themselves. And then the last thing we'll talk about here is profiles and permissions. It's not going to be in this exact order. I built it out that I think how it makes logical sense to me how to talk about things, but we'll go from there. As I said before, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just interrupt me. And then, yeah, I'll try to answer your question. So the first thing we're talking about here is company settings. Company settings is something you have to know about. It's basically what you've purchased from Salesforce. So this is the information about your company. So this will give you information about your address, your licenses. If you're going to have fiscal year, not the standard fiscal, if you want to customize it, you can set it up here. This is also where you could set up business hours and holidays. Business hours and holidays, that's used in your support processes. And if you wanted to turn on multi-currency, you could turn your currency here and manage it as well. And if you want to enable any trusted IP branches, you enable company information as well. This is a quick view of what a company information page looks like. Like I said before, we have an org name, who your primary contact is. So that's just going to be the person. If Salesforce needs to reach out to somebody, this is who they're going to reach out to for the org information. We've had the address. If you put the address in there, you have the address in there. This is, like I said, where we could have a custom fiscal year. You can enable it here. If you wanted to have multiple currencies, you would check this box. You click edit, check the box, and then you have it there. And then you can then click the currency setup and set up the multiple currencies that could be available in your organization. On the other side here, we have our default locale, default language, and your time zone as well. So those are just that's your company defaults. These are your user defaults. Your users can have different ones, but this is what your company's set up as. And then we also specify your corporate currency. So if you do enable multi-currency, what is your base currency that everything is tied back to? That's going to be set here on your company information page as well. If you're ever wondering how much data you've used in your org, you can come to your company information page here as well and check out what's available there. And if you're using files, you can see how much space you have left for your files as well. If you're using any APIs or streaming events, you can see what your limits are there, where you're at. And then if you ever need to create a case for Salesforce help or anything like that, they'll ask you what your Salesforce organization ID. That's what this number right here would be. I blocked mine out just because I don't want cases being submitted for mine that don't need to be submitted. And then last but not least, they'll tell you what your organization edition is and your instance. This is we're looking at developer edition. This is one of those free ones that you can get from Salesforce. But if you had Pro or Unlimited or Professional Unlimited or Enterprise, you would see that listed there as well. And then last but not least, your instance number. That's very important because that tells you what pod you're in. Depending on what pod you're in, sometimes that would dictate when you get releases, if there's outages. If you ever need to go to trust.salesforce.com and you want to see if your org is being impacted by anything, you type in your instance number there to do that. If you've enabled domain in your Salesforce org and you go trust.salesforce.com, you can also just type in your domain name, and then you can find out everything from there as well. But like I said, on this page, on that page we're looking at, if we were to scroll down, we can scroll down a little bit further. You can see all the different licenses that are available. So we have our standard user license, we have our permission set licenses, and any other feature licenses. These are the only ones that you purchase from Salesforce. If you're to purchase like an App Exchange product, those licenses will not show in there. They'll show on the license information on the actual product on that side of the house. So this is all just the Salesforce licenses that you've purchased or that are available to you in your org. All right. If you want to set up a trusted IP range, trusted IP range allow your users, basically if they're in that range, they don't have to authenticate. It still asks for username and password, but no verification. If they are the IP range, they can still log in. They just need to verify with the company's verification tool. Essentially, you go to security, type in network access, type in the trusted IP ranges from the starting IP and the ending. Like I said, if they're in that range when they're logging in, they don't have to authenticate. They just have to provide username and password. On the test, this is pretty much the question is like, hey, if we want to limit the amount of people who are trying to log in, they complain about the authentication process of that. What could you do? You could set up trusted IP ranges to help with that if you have that available to you. The next thing we're talking about here is fiscal year. The standard model follows the Gregorian calendar, but you can always customize it to your own years and quarters. Some of the other common practices that I've seen are the 4-4-5 method, where it's or the 13 period structure, just basically breaking out the fiscal quarters into different types of longevity. This is also where you can also set your start date for your fiscal year, because sometimes like if you're Salesforce, your start date actually isn't the 1st of the year, it is the 1st of February. So if you need to adjust those things for your reporting and things of that nature, you can go ahead and set up your fiscal year by doing that. The purpose of the test, that asked, can you do it? Or like if they say they'll point out an example, like they'll give an example of a custom fiscal year and then ask what you do is you just enable fiscal year and set it up accordingly. Like I mentioned before, when we were talking about business hours and holidays, you can set up a business hours, and then you can set up basically these are the hours that you're available to work. This is primarily used in support cases. It's the only area where I've ever used it is actually support. But basically, it's when your support team is available to work. You can specify from and where, and then you can also add in holidays. With holidays, you can make things reoccurring, or you can also just make them one time. Sometimes it's not uncommon to have multiple holidays set up, but you can only enable one at a time. So that's one thing to know. When you set up business hours, you can have multiples in there, but you can only have one active. All right. And if you want to have multiple currencies in your org, we do, like I said, need to turn that setting on. That's what the managed currencies. You do have to enable that by default. That back in the home page there, on the security, the company information page, you have to enable it there first, just by clicking the edit, check that box. The one that becomes available, you can click the manage currencies, and then from there you can manage your currencies. You can also turn on advanced currency management. This allows you to set rates for a period of time. You do have to set that up. None of that is automatic. There are application products out there that do that type of thing. With advanced currency management, essentially you say for a set period of time that you set what the exchange rate between the currencies are. That way, if you do have to ever update the currencies, you don't update all the exchange rates across the board. And that can be if you update your exchange rates, that could be problematic. So you have opportunity from 2 years ago, and exchange rate was $1.25 to $1, and now it's $1.50 to $1. That if you don't set up advanced currency management, that opportunity from a year ago with that exchange rate would also be reflected the new exchange rate to then inflate how much your opportunity actually was in that other currency, or deflate the opportunity and the other in whatever your business currency. So setting up advanced currency management is pretty much a must if you're going to have multiple currencies in your org. If you're going to be doing that, it's just something that's the beast of the nature there. But you can do it without, but like I said, it can affect our reporting, especially if you're looking at older opportunities and things of that nature. It can really affect your reporting, and sometimes it confuses everyone. So you're better off getting it set up ahead of time and be prepared for it and managing those exchange rates for those periods of time. All right. With the setup audit trail, you have to know what this is. Mainly, it wants to know what the limits are and what it's used for. Basically, the audit trail shows you the metadata changes in your org. If you go to this view setup audit trail, it's going to tell you your most recent 20 logs, so the last 20 actions that affected metadata. If you want to see more than that, you can download. Your trail, and it'll give you the last 180 days worth of logs. If you need more than that, you're going to have to build a system out to basically store all that information if you want. But for the purpose of the test, it's what will it show you? It'll show you the most 20 and how many days worth can you get, which is 180. And then the other question typically around setup audit trail is what does it do, which is just shows you all the metadata changes that took place in your org. All right. So within Salesforce, there are some UI settings that you can set up and enable. Things these are like features of Salesforce, so you can enable things like collapsible sections, show quick create, inline editing, the big one there, and enhanced list. So these are all just UI settings that you can enable or disable depending on what you're going to be utilizing in your org. Inline editing, just a reminder, if you do enable that and you're going to be using it on the list views, all the records within that list view have to be of the same record type for it to work. But some UI settings, just quick turn them on or turn them off, use whatever you want. By default, a lot of these are checked. And then you just turn additional ones on if you need them. Some other settings here that come up quite often, if you like to enable printable list views, this enables Salesforce notification banner. This is actually one that most people want to turn off. If you've ever been in an org and you have a Salesforce like advertisement at the top of your page in the banner, and you don't want to see that, you can come here and turn that off so that you don't see that information. Some calendar settings that you may want. It's just like these are like life experience, like quality of life upgrades or downgrades, depending on what you want to do. If you want to enable middle names for person or suffixes for person, you can enable those name settings there. Depending on what you're doing, that may or not be a use case for you. Within setup there, we have all these different types of settings around. I can go through every single one. But you can, some of these, I would think these enable ones here, I would keep there. Some of the ones you might want to keep an eye on. You may or may not want them depending on what you're doing in your org. All right. The next part we're going to talk about here is Lightning App Builder. Lightning App Builder is basically where you go build all your Lightning pages for your org. So by default, every object you work in Lightning has a default page. You can customize that page. You can also create multiple pages and then assign them out based on profiles and apps and what's the other one? But we'll talk more about that in a little bit here. Session settings. This is the big thing here. Is for the you set up your session security. A lot of times here it's the timeout value. How long do you have basically till you time out your org of inactivity? You can also force lag on submission timeouts. Those are the big ones in there. Any of the caching ones here, if you're using a developer org, I recommend turning this one off here, especially if you're making updates. This right here, if you enable that, if you make like create a new field, it may take a little bit of time to show up in your org. If you enable that, basically every time you load a page, it refreshes with whatever available at that time. So whatever the most current updates are, it's going to do that. It may take a little bit longer in dev, but that's fine. We're in dev, we're doing it because we want to see things in production. I recommend having that checked. It does make the end user experience a little bit faster because, well, it's faster, so it's a little bit more pleasant for them. But like I said, if you're making the updates, it may take a little bit longer to show. But if you are following the method of making those updates and applying those changes outside of business hours, of like your company's working hours, then it shouldn't be too much of an issue because it just takes a little bit of time for it to get cached. All right. Again, these are just the different settings here. Allow Lightning login. Basically, just about everyone has it enabled in every org now, so that's just a standard setting. Your clickjack protection if you're using individual course pages, I would recommend turn those on. These are automatically enabled. You can't turn these off, so no, nothing work there. And then you could also add any trusted domains that if you wanted to for inline frames and things of that nature. So if you're going to have anything show up in Salesforce, like you're pulling information from a third-party site and you want to protect it, you could add that domain as a trusted domain there. And these are actually the last of the session settings here. There's it really depends on what you're doing in your org. Salesforce by default turns on most of the ones on that you would want, but you can come in here and enable additional protections if need be, if you want. And then one of the last things here is the session security levels. Multi-factor authentication is pretty much the default right now. And then that's the highest assurance. The different levels here have, these are just your standard ones. This is the most preferred method of doing things is multi-factor authentication. That's also a universal rule, I guess, now from Salesforce is that everyone should be utilizing multi-factor authentication to log into Salesforce. Not necessarily theirs, but be utilizing a multi-factor authentication tool to log into Salesforce. All right. Back to the Lightning App Builder. This is where, like I said, we can build pages, home pages, and record pages. Right now we're looking actually at an account page, Lightning record page here, and we can see we have our labels, our developer name, page name, the object it tells you right here. And basically what we can do is all these different components on the left here, we can drop and drag them wherever we want them in the page. The details tab here, this actually is pointing to our page layout. So that's actually all the different fields. And on top of Lightning App Builder here, we have the details here. We can also turn on advanced page layouts here where we could actually get a list of all the fields that are tied to the object instead of utilizing a page layout assignment, the old standard page layout assignment. We could just build out whatever fields we want them on this particular page as well. All right. The app menu, if you're wondering what the app menu is, that's I don't know if I have a screen here, but basically the app menu is your waffle. All the different apps are going to be available into there. You can set them up and here, so you can figure out what apps you want, and then you assign the apps to the appropriate profile. So you can set the default order of the apps for the users and however you want them to see, and then go from there. Global actions. If you're not familiar with global actions, if you're ever on a page at the very top layout, we have this little plus mark here. These are your global actions, and then the global actions are things that you can create the global actions, and they're just tasks you can do from any page. So there are actions that you can do from any page, and the global actions, just so you know, they can't pull values from the current page you're on. So any of these things you can do here, they can create new records, but they're not going to pull any information from the current record. So let's say I was on an account and I went up to my global action and created a new event. I would have to select the account as one of the related records for the event. It wouldn't automatically pop for us. But if I were on the account and I went to the new event activity section of the page layout, that would populate it. So global actions are good for when you have to do a lot of one-off things, or if there's even creating objects that you just need to quickly create something that's not really tied to whatever you're on. Global actions are great for those types of things. All right. So next thing we're talking about here is list view. So when we're on a object that has a tab, we're going to have what we call list view. These are our list views here. We have multiple here. I call these your first introduction to reports. They're just a little mini report here, and you can do a lot of different things with them. These are great for queue management, so managing records going to views of creating, like if you have a case, create multiple case queues, and then the cases get fed into those queues, and you just manage those views out of those. But like I said, it's like a mini report. We can manage a lot of different things within here. We can create new ones. We can clone existing ones. We can modify the fields to display. We can delete them if we're no longer using them. We can also modify who can see them. To create a new one, you just click that new button, give it a name, and then you can specify who can see the list view. Only I means I can see it. All users can see this list view. It means that if they have access to the account tab there, they can see the list view for this, and then otherwise you can specify particular users or groups of users. I point this out here because there are test questions around when we set up list views, how should you set up the visibility of the list view? So this is what they're talking about right here. All others can see it, or you can share it with a group of users. Most commonly, either it's if I'm creating a list view for myself, I'm going to keep it there for myself. Most of the time, it's shared with a list. If you can share it across the board, if it's not a generic, like all accounts or things of that nature, you can share it with a group of users. Most commonly is like back to that support case. If I have a queue that is managing support, and maybe I only want that queue to see those records, I could say that I could create a list view that's based off of that queue, and then just share it with that group of people that are in that queue. We can also filter the record. So one of the ways you would do that thing here is filter records. So I could say owner, filter all of my accounts where I can add the owner equals that queue, and then I can add multiple conditions for that. So you can build multiple conditions, and then you can actually provide filter logic. So you can say, I want a 1 and 2 or 3, or 1 and 3 or 2. So you can add multiple layers of filters in there, and then add custom logic to it to display however you want. So in this here, I'm doing the account currency equals one of the options that I'm selecting. So let's say if the account currency equals US dollars, that would only show where the account currency for the accounts would be to US dollars. So there's just some filters there. I have all accounts where billing equals New York. So I have one that shows up in there. And if I could add additional filters here, and then I could add additional filter logic if I wanted to as well. All right. As you saw here, we had all the different columns. By default, I can come in here on that list view. I can say I want to select which fields I want to display. Just go in here and I grab the different fields that I want. You are capped at 10, so make sure it's the 10 that you want, not you don't want to put fields in there that you're not going to be utilizing. So sometimes like account owner alias may be great for some list views, but other ones you may not want. Any questions so far, any of that? All right. Next thing we're talking about is user setup. So username needs to be a form of email. Username has to be unique. You can't use the same username in multiple orgs. So you also have to have a different username for every org you're in. The alias is something that gets created for you automatically. Typically, it takes your first initial from your first name and the last 4 characters from that. You can change that. You're capped at 5 characters. Your user license, this basically states what features of Salesforce that user can have. So by default, there's a Salesforce license, there's a platform license, a chatter license. Depending on the license you have, this is one of your first layers of security into Salesforce, and it basically tells you what could you have access to. So if I have chatter, a chatter license, all I have access to is chatter. I can't access other records. That's pretty straightforward there. But if I have a Salesforce license, this kind of opens the floodgate to me, and I can I have the potential to do everything within the org, and then my profiles and roles kind of control what I can and can't do within the org at that point. There's any feature licenses, marketing user, service cloud. Just as a side note, if you're ever trying to build a campaign in Salesforce and you can't create one, make sure your user has marketing user checked. If that's not checked, you can't create a campaign. And this is also where you get set up that user's locale settings, approver settings, newsletter settings. So if they don't want to see those things, you can modify them here. But when it comes to user management, whoever's going to be managing the users, most likely your admin, they basically you create and edit users. So your primary function is to create new users and modify users' permissions, more or less, and maybe additional information about them. You will grant passwords or you grant permissions for them. Manage their users. There is a tool. If you want to mass create users, you can use Data Loader if you really want to. But within Salesforce, there's a tool that allows you to have 10 users at a time. That's important to note because they ask questions on the test every now and then. Is that if you're creating users within Salesforce, how many can you create up to a time? And the number is 10. Some of the other things that you'll be doing as an admin is you're going to be unlocking users. Yes, users lock themselves out, and sometimes it depends on your session settings. If they're locked out, you have to let them back in. So you have to go to user, click unlock, and then allows them back in. Most of the time, you also have to reset their password because if they locked themselves out, they probably don't know the password, so you probably need to change that for them as well. Deactivating users. So just as a reminder, in Salesforce, we deactivate users. You don't delete them. Basically, when you deactivate a user, they can't log anymore. The reason why we don't delete users and we don't rename active users with new email addresses of that nature is that we want to keep that history of what that person did in the org. If you created a user and you renamed them to a new user, and then all of a sudden, Susie was working in the org for 3 years, and then she moved on, and then you have brought a new person, and then you gave it to Billy, and now Billy has the same user that Susie has. Well, he now has he's now accountable for all the things that Susie did in the past, which you probably don't want to happen. You want to keep track of that information that Susie did it, not Billy did it. So you deactivate Susie, you still keep the history of what Susie built, but then when Billy comes in with his profile, his new user record there, you can see what he does, and that way you can keep the two things different from each other. You don't want to reuse an existing user. If a user is no longer with the company, deactivate them. And then freeze and unfreeze. If you need to temporarily freeze a user, basically prevent them from logging in, you can freeze that user and then they can't log in. Everything else works perfectly for them. So a lot of times freeze gets utilized when you at higher up potentially leaves, and there's a lot of reports and things of that nature, roll-up summaries that are tied to that individual. A lot of times you freeze them so you can get all this stuff figured out, and then you deactivate them once you get everything kind of moved over. But basically freezing prevents them from logging in, and then everything else, like your roles, all your your role hierarchy, all this stuff still works with that because they're still active in Salesforce. You're still utilizing a license. That user just can't log in. And sometimes you need to freeze somebody to do something, then you can unfreeze them and let them back in. Things come up, but that's just kind of how you can do those types of things there. When you're deactivating a user, you can deactivate a user, remove them from all the other groups and sharing privileges. That's why I was talking about sometimes we freeze those users first, and then may move everything around, then we deactivate them, because sometimes they could have a devastating effect on everyone within the org, depending on where they sit. But when you deactivate a user, you can remove from account teams, you remove from the opportunity teams, close opportunities. You can just basically, we can pick and choose what you want to do from that particular user that you're deactivating. Just a reminder, when you're deactivating a user, basically this is what happens. When it comes to user license and billing, just remember, you pay for the number of licenses, you don't pay for how many you use. So if I have 15 licenses and I only use 10 licenses, I'm paying for 15 licenses no matter what. Users in customer hierarchy fields, you can't deactivate a user that is like a custom hierarchy field. You must delete the field or remove it completely, or remove them from it, remove their association with that. If they're the sole recipient of the workflow email alert, you can't deactivate them. So you basically have to go to that alert and modify it. If they're a custom portal admin, you have to basically assign a new portal admin for that. Record access, user loses access to all the records that are mainly shared or shared as teams. Users higher in the record also lose access to the deactivated users' records. So best practice is to reassign ownership of records either before or after deactivating a user so that you don't lose that visibility into this record. So it also depends on your sharing settings in your org. If your sharing settings are a lot more public, a deactivation of a user isn't as impactful as a completely private org. Chatter, if they are in chatter and they if they're deactivated, they're removed from followers. But if you reactivate them, of their current list that they were utilizing when they were deactivated, it gets reinstalled. And if you're ever worried about a deactivating user who uploaded a bunch of files, any files that they've uploaded into Salesforce remain, they don't go away. You will have them as long as they're in the system. Someone has to physically delete them out of the org. All right, so we're talking about profiles and permission sets. This is actually one of my with profiles and permissions. This tells you what the user can do in the org. So once they have that license, they have the user, they're granted access to Salesforce. On the profiles and permissions, that's basically tell them what they can or cannot do within the org. And this is a lot of information being thrown at you all at once right here. So with a profile and permission sets, essentially you can do both. You can do all these actions with both of them. Permission sets are just an extension of profiles. There's a whole migration of profiles to permissions that's coming up in the future. As of now, I'm going to cover what's here on the test future state. Profiles are going to be a lot more simplified, and everything we're talking about is really applied to permission sets. So I'll talk about how everything works in conjunction present day, because that's what the test is going to talk about. But future state profiles, honestly, they're not going away, but they're going to be severely reduced. But with profiles and permission sets, you can set up the assigned apps. You can set up the different tabs that can be available. So by default, you have these different tab settings. Default on means that tab is available to that user. Tab heading means that the tab is hidden from them. They can't see that tab at all. And default off, which you don't see on this list here, means that it's not on for them, but they can go find it and then they can view that tab as well. So a default on, default off, you're able to see the tabs. Tab hidden means you can't see it at all. Record types are defined at the profile level. So the record type of the different objects. So depending on, like on the account, if we have a record type, it could be specified as, we have a customer and we have like a patient or something along those lines. You have multiple record types that specify the different types of accounts you could have. You would specify those at the profile level. At the profile level, you would also specify the default. You can assign record type access to with the permission sets, but at the at the profile level, you set the default value for record types. And then with both permission sets and profiles, you can set object permissions, field permissions, any of the custom permissions. Login hours and login IP ranges are still tied to the profile as well. Login hour just means that the user can only log in between these hours. I'm just going to go over here because this is where we have login hours. So essentially with login hours, you specify if somebody has this profile, this is when they can log in, this is when they can log out. If you're wondering what happens if you have login hours, they can't log in before the time, but if they're logged in, let's say the end time ends at 5 o'clock and it's now 5:02 and they're still in Salesforce, they'll be in Salesforce until they submit that record. Once they submit that record, they'll be kicked out. So that's how that part works there. Login IP ranges, basically, the user with that profile has to be within the IP range to log in. All right. These are some of the default profile types on Chatter. Their chatter profiles, just remember they can't be edited, they can't be deleted, they have no access to data. Standard profiles, they can't be edited, they can't be deleted, they do have access to data. And then your custom profiles, they can be edited, they can be deleted, and they also have access to data as well. As a reminder, the best practices when making custom profiles is to make custom profiles from standard profiles, or choose an existing profile that is like the profile you're trying to create, and then make edits to that custom profile to add or remove the permissions that are needed for that particular profile. Same concept also applies to permission sets. When you're creating a permission set, don't start from scratch and find an existing permission set if you have one that's close to it, and then follow the same steps. Permission sets, there aren't any standard permission sets really out there, so sometimes you do have to start from scratch and add on how you see fit. Like I said, permission sets are the extension of the profile. Users can have many permission sets. Also applies to permission set groups. Every user can only have one profile, but they can have many permission sets and many permission set groups assigned to them. Permission sets are great for adding one-off permissions like users or managers. Sometimes you have a standard profile for sales, but maybe the sales manager needs some additional privileges, so you'd create an additional permission set just assigned to that person so they can edit some particular field that nobody else can, that type of deal. All right, let's talk about permission set groups. So a permission set group is basically, it's a group that has multiple permissions in it. So the permission set group here is the gray box. Each of the permission sets are something that we created. We can create a permission set, add all those fields of all those permission sets to that group, and then I can send that group to an individual. If I assign that group to an individual, all the permission sets will be applied to that user, so they inherit all those permission sets. I will say also with permission sets, there's this concept of a mute permission, which I don't have a slide here for. Essentially, I can create a mute permission that negates permissions within this permission set group. So if I wanted to, I could say, let's say permission set 1, 2, and 3 all have delete access to account. I could create a mute permission that says they don't have delete access to account, apply it to this group. So if this is the only spot where that permission is being applied to that user is within this group here, they will lose access to it. So this only applies to that access within this particular group, not the overall access of the user. So their profile could say they have something else. Another permission that could say they have access to those things. The mute only applies to that particular group, not the whole individual. All right, so here we go. We have two in this permission set here. We have two permission sets. We have our sales contract and a sales order. So that's how we just added 2 into that. And then we can go from there. Just as a quick reminder, you can have up to 100 permission sets in a permission set group. That's a lot. If your org has a large number of permission sets, using permission set groups might be a good way to do that. When viewing permission sets and groups in a list view, no actions are available in the list view drop-down menu. If you're including session-based permission sets and permission set group, the permission is in them. They do not require session-based activation for users to assign to the group. When a permission set is part of a group, you can still send individual permission set apart from the permission set group. So that if we go back here, I could assign this group with permission set 1 in there. Maybe I have a mute on here that negates something here, but then I could also take this permission set here and still assign it to that person outside of that group. So I could have multiple permission sets and from multiple permission set groups dictating my access to things in Salesforce. Here's that muting permission I was talking about. Like I said, you can add one mute permission. Basically, I create a mute permission and then I negate something that could be in one or more of the permissions that are available in the org. And like I said, it only applies to the group. It doesn't apply to the overall user. It only applies to the particular group that we're in. So like I said, if I had that permission set here and I assigned it to this user outside of the group, they would gain all those permissions back to that permission set. So these are the 4 layers of data access. This is important to know because depending on where you're at in the test, they're going to kind of dictate what's going on here. The organization layer, basically, do you have access to the org? So first, be a user. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, Jake. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you go back to the previous sentence?
With the what?
Permission sets, the one which you're showing the muted permission. That one.
This one?
Yeah, this one. So I have a question here. So you said like if I having one mute permission set, how it works, like so, okay, I have a three permission set group. So why the 1, 2, 3 will not work if I add a mute permission set 3?
Oh, so they would still work. The mute permissions are going to negate something within this permission. So let me explain that a little bit clear here. So when you build a mute permission, let's say permission set 1 here has delete on account, permission set 2 has delete on account, and permission set 3 also had delete on account. If I created a mute permission that says no, they can't have delete on account, it would negate that portion of the permission set on in this group here. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, got it. So, but this is the only way, like to prevent one set of access from the permission set, like mute or any other, practices also being there.
Yeah, so the mute only applies to the group. You can't use it anywhere else outside of this. So if you're truly trying to prevent access to something, you're gonna have to control it either at the profile level or any of the additional permissions that get applied. So with the move to the new model that's coming in a couple of years here of everything being permission set based, your permission set here, the permission set group is going to be more commonly used. The reason why they introduced the mute permissions is that way you can create less permission sets, but put them in a group so you can grant overall access. So let's say this was a sales user's permission set group. You can give them lead access, opportunity access, and account access, let's say, but maybe we create a mute permission there because maybe this has a lot more access in there that we want to take away some of the access for that particular group of users. We could take away some of those permissions within that group, because if we're only sending this permission set group to the user and that's all that's being assigned, we have a lot more control of things. But the reason why I point out that if we add things on top of it that are outside of the group, that you could add additional privileges, because in the end, the overall access that the user has is everything combined together. So that's their profiles, any permission sets that are assigned to them, any permission set groups that are assigned to them. So we're going to take everything and add it all together, and at the end, we're going to spit it out what's available to them. So the mute only applies in here. If they only have the one group, the mute kind of applies overall to the user. But if they have other things outside of this particular permission set group, you'd have to kind of analyze that a bit further. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. So if I have a mute permission and if I want to delete only the delete access from permissions at 2 and 3, will that be possible?
So this right here looks at all permission sets in here.
Okay.
If the permission set doesn't have access to it, it just ignores it. But the mute doesn't. It doesn't specify which permission set's going to remove it to within the group. It's an overall arching thing. So you could have 15 permissions to give up to 100, like I said. So if all 100 had delete on account and you created a mute permission to remove that, it would remove the access within the group. It doesn't actually remove it from the permission set. So like if I were to send the same permission set outside of the group, like if I send it to the user over here, I would still have delete on account outside of this group. It's only being applied to within this group here.
Oh, okay, it's applies to all the groups. Yeah, got it. Thank you. Sure.
Yeah. So the mute only, it's not removing it from the permission per se, it's removing it within the context of the group.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Any other questions around the permission set group? I'm actually releasing a video hopefully next week more on muting permission sets. So hopefully that will also help clear up things as well. But back to the 4 layers of data access. Like I said, the first one is organization. First of all, do I have a license? Do I have the ability to log into Salesforce? And then within that, am I within my login hours? If I have login hours enabled, do I have a trusted IP range? Do I have login IP ranges? Those are all ways of my first layer of access to get to Salesforce. Do I have one of those things? And then the next layer of access is the object access. So objects, do I have access to them? So my Salesforce license is going to help dictate what I have access to, like I said, if I have a charter license, I have access to no objects. So basically my data access ends there. I may have access to some groups and things of that nature, but I won't have access to any of the records. So your Salesforce license is going to dictate what you have objects that are available to you, and also your profiles and permissions that are going to dictate what objects can be available to you. So we just talked about some of those. That's going to dictate what you can see. The next layer is my record access. And do you have access to the record? Just because I have access to accounts doesn't mean I get to see all the accounts in the org. Or what defaults are going to impact that. Role hierarchy is going to impact that. Any sharing rules or teams and manual sharing also going to impact that. So just because I have access to the object doesn't mean I can see all the records within there. And then the very last layer here is your field. Can I see the value of a field on a record? So I have access to account. Do I get to see all the fields on the account, or are there some fields that I may or may not be able to see? So we can set up some field level security when we actually set up a field, set on the field level security and also on the profile and then in the permission set. That's the best way of doing it. They say page allowed. I don't really say that. Just page allowed does not provide security in my mind. You can remove it from the view, but that doesn't mean they can't go look up, or you can't look up that field in this field, or can't look up that field in the report. It may not be presented to them on the page layout, but it may not. They still have access to the field per se. It's a semi layer of access. It's not being presented to them on that particular page. So I don't really like to call it a layer. But some people do. So back to organizational security. First of all, you have to have that. You have to have a license, but then you can also set up some of our other things like our user passwords. So we'll set up our user passwords. Are we going to force password history? What's your password length? Basic password policy types of things. Also recommend you set up multi-factor authentication. So make sure you enable that, and then can go from there. That's going to be the safest way to secure access into your. So they have to have a license, and they also have to follow your protocols in order to log in. All right, my domain. So I have this is my dev domain here that you see here. Basically, I can create a domain. This is just another way of making your org more secure. It's a requirement now, so every new org that gets created by Salesforce will have a my domain enabled by it. All existing ones should be converted to have my domain turned on. It's just makes everything a lot more secure and safe by enabling this. Then you can also, when you set up my domain, you can also require that you could require the logging to Salesforce only through my domain. So you can say you can only log in at Jake at Batman, whatever the case may be. You can only log in that way. You can't log in at Salesforce.com. All right. When it comes to the objects, all the objects in Salesforce, they have basic permissions in them. These are your CRUD. You can read, create, edit, and delete, view all, and modify all. Read means I can see records. Create means I can make records. Edit means I can modify records. Delete means I can remove records. View all means I can see all records, and modify all can see all records and modify all records. So they can basically do everything. The view all and modify all permissions, I don't like to hand those out to I really don't like to hand them out to anyone other than a system admin, because they override all your sharing permissions that you set up in your org, which we're going to talk about in a minute here. Essentially, you can grant, read, create, edit, and delete, and then remember that just means that that's what they have access to. So if I have read, it means I can read records, like I can read accounts that I have access to. We're talking about access in a minute here. If I have access to no accounts and I have read, I still can't read any accounts because I don't have access to any accounts, and that's all set up with our sharing settings here. But when it comes to profiles, we also can specify the access to the field. So that's the field level security we're talking about. Is it visible? Is it read-only? Depending on where you're at, if you're on the profile or if you're on the actual field. So we're on the actual field here. We say it can be visible for these profiles. It can be read-only for these profiles. If you're on the profile, it's required or editable. you can see it on that side of the house as well. So depending on where you're at, you can see it. They're just inverse of each other. But field level security basically tells me if I can see the field, and then I can also, if it's read only, it means I can only see the field and I won't be able to modify it. So visible only check means that I can see the field and modify the field. Profiles, permission sets versus sharing. So like I said, profiles are like your driver license that tell you what you can do in Salesforce, but just because you have access to accounts doesn't mean you get to drive all the records in the account. So like I said, the profile, it's your driver's license that tells you, hey, yes, you can drive vehicles, but just because I have the permission to, I have the ability to drive a Ferrari, doesn't mean I could go drive the Ferrari, because I have to have access to a Ferrari to drive it. So I don't get that permission. I don't have that access to that record, so I can't view that particular record. Like I said, that comes and to record access is basically sharing. So we have our org-wide defaults. OWDs is what they refer to a lot of times, but it's org-wide defaults there. Then we have a role hierarchy, which expands our sharing access a little bit more vertically, and then we have a sharing roles, which specify, like, depending of it, that you can be criteria or role based, and then we have a teams of management. So as we move along here, we can grant additional access to things that we see fit. Apparently, I have the slide in here twice. But one of the other things we can do is you can build what we call restriction rules. Basically, after everything's analyzed after the fact, you can build a restriction rule that says no, you can't have access to account ABC. So you can build restriction rules to do that. This is a newer feature within Salesforce in the past year or two here. I just didn't utilize that very often. I recommend trying to control everything in here first before applying our overall restriction rules, because you don't want to become too reliant on the restriction rules. So yeah, I would just basically, we're gonna go through all these here in a minute, but we're gonna go through it. Control everything at this level here, the org-wide role sharing and manual and team sharing. Use restriction rules as a very last ditch effort, because they're not always 100% reliable in my experience. But let's talk about org-wide defaults and everything else we're talking about. This is very reliable, providing that you know what you're doing and it makes you set it up correctly. This is a very reliable approach to things. But org-wide default settings, this is for every object in your org. You set the default access to those particular records. So we can say a record can have a private. If it's private, so let's say for a lead here, we made everything private. That means only I could see my leads that I created. I couldn't see any other leads unless I was shared with me with one of the other ways we can share. But by default, if it's private, it means nobody else can see any of the records that I create, and I can't see any records that anybody else creates. So it's very hidden in that aspect. Public read write or public read only means that I can see my records that I've created, and I can edit the records I created, provided my profile gives me those abilities. So just remember, just because if something is public read, we'll talk about right now, but basically if it's public read only means I have access to see my leads, and I can see other leads in the org as well. So everyone can see all the leads that have access to leads, but they can't modify all the leads. They can only modify the ones that they own, providing that their profile states that they can modify things. Public read write means that I have the ability to see all the leads, and I can modify all the leads regardless if I own them or not. Public read write transfer means I can see all the leads, update all the leads, can also transfer ownership of those. Public read write transfer is only applicable to leads and cases. So just so you know, that's one of the only ones there that's there. One of the other settings here is the controlled by parent, or in this, there's also controlled by campaign on here. Basically, if the object is a child in a relationship, so or a detail in a master detail, it's going to inherit all its permissions from its parent. So most commonly, you see for that would be like I said, the detail and master detail relationship. If that object has that, doesn't have that complete access, is going to inherit all its access from its parent. So this is our beginning level here. Depending on where we start, really kind of depicts where we're going to start here. So this right here, we're looking more like a private model here, so they can bring grant access to it. If you come out the gates with public read, this moves up across the board, across the line here. But just because I can see everything doesn't mean I can modify everything. So we could use additional the rules, the role hierarchy, sharing rules, and teams to grant edit access to those abilities. And then, but if we come up with our org right defaults, plug read right across the board, a lot of these other things don't really aren't as applicable because we've opened the org up so much right in the beginning that we don't have to go modify these other things because they already have those access to those records. All right. So with role hierarchy, you can grant access vertically. This is your vertical access. I kind of have a little example here. It's used for accessing records and sometimes editability. Yep, this is being recorded too, so I'll be posting this on my YouTube channel so you can catch up there as well. But yeah, with the use for record access and sometimes editability, so as you can grant additional access to records, you can also potentially grant edit access to them. If your organization-wide defaults are more restrictive than public read-write, you can use a role hierarchy to make records more accessible to users. Like I said, if you have it more open with your org-wide defaults, you don't have to rely so much on some of these things. For the edit and visibility access, you still may want to set up your role hierarchy because it's helpful for like reports and things of that nature. Out of the box, these are standard auto use, and you can custom objects are chosen. So if you look back here, when we were sending the, if we were sending, it says grant execute hierarchies, this is role hierarchies. All your standard objects out of the box have that checked by default. You can't uncheck it for standard objects. Any custom objects, you can specify if you want access to the object to be granted using role hierarchies or not. This is kind of a little cool feature there. When it comes to sharing roles, there are two types of sharing roles. There's owner-based and criteria-based. Owner-based, basically, we look to see who is the owner of the record. And we say, if it's one of these things, we're going to say, if it's owned by such and such group or territory or role, we're going to share it with another either public group, role, territory, or that we can specify what. So it doesn't have to match public group to public group. It could be either one or. Basically, if it's owned by somebody in here, we're sharing it with somebody that's owned over here. And then we select what access. So depending on the object we're doing, we're looking at an account right now. So account has some child objects that are tied to it. So we have this is the default account and contact access. So we can say this, if you're in this if we're in the public group that was selected here, and we're taking whoever owns those records that are part of that public group, and we're sending it with this public group here, that this public group is getting read access to account. You can also do private, or private means it's hidden, or read write means they can see it and also update it. But we can also hide access if there's like some of the subordinate objects as well. So we have our opportunity cases, we're hiding them. So in this particular owner-based sharing rule, there's a public group. Any records that are owned by a particular public group are being shared with another public group, and we're granting them read-only access to the account and contract. Criteria-based is a little more common. Basically, you can set the criteria for that particular record. So you're going to evaluate the record individually based on some criteria on the record, and then you share that with like again another public group, role, territory, however you want. So based on where the criteria of the record is, it's going to be shared. And then once again, the level of access is the same as before, just a different way of sharing the record. So one is owner-based and one is criteria-based. On the test, you need to know with the two types of sharing rules you can create, owner and criteria. And then you also need to know in that they may have a scenario-based types of questions. They're not very difficult, but depending on the use case, a lot of times it's like they're like so in this particular queue, blah blah blah. What you do, you should create a public group, use the public group sharing to share with, like sometimes it's the service team over here needs to be shared with the cases, and the service that the service team is working needs to be shared with the cases, and the cases need to be shared with a sales team, and the grant and read access to them, that type of deal. So they need to see those records. That's a potential option that you may need to do for that. Manual sharing, just so you know, org right even needs to be private or read for the button to show. So if you want to do manual sharing, your org right defaults for the object, like I said, need to be private or read. Because if they're public read write, they already have access to those things, so there's no need for the sharing button. But essentially, you could just say who you're sharing it with and where's the access that you're going to be granting them. So you can, once again, the access read private and read write. You need to specify that share that needs to be set up for them. Team sharing is only available on account cases and opportunities. This is where you can create ad hoc teams. You can also set up default team sharing. At the user level, you can say any opportunities that this team, and then so forth and so forth. This another way of doing, it's just more or less doing that manual share as well, but it's a little bit more robust, and it's also only available for these couple objects. So a lot of times when the question you see around team sharing come along the lines of that the service team, like they all have a case and they all automatically want to add 3 people to them so they can always have access to the things that they need to. And the option here is that we want to set up a case team for that particular user, so that every time they get a new case, the ownership gets assigned or the record gets shared with these additional people so that they can help them out and solve that particular case. All right, and that, I believe, is my last slide. So any questions on the content we covered today? I know I blasted a lot of information out there for everyone, but let me know if you have any questions. And if not, I will release you all into the day or night, wherever you're at. Okay, so I don't see any questions. I will say thank you for coming, and I plan on doing another session next month for the next portion here for admin training. Cool.
Thank you, Jake, for the meeting. It was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.